Pwede na. Okay, thank you. Ah, so, maulang umaga sa ating lahat. Hey, echo. Kinababala ko ngayong umaga na kilala ang ating speaker, si Dr. Maria Vanessa Baria-Rodriguez. Isang tubentan ay Capiz at graduate ng Capiz National High School. Tapos ay nag-BS Biology sa University of the Philippines, Los Baños. At pumasok sa Marine Science Institute noong 2003. Sa kumukulab sa ilalim ni Dr. Perry Alina sa GF Sociology Project. Tapos ng isang taon bilang research assistant, siya nagsimula bilang master student dito sa MSI. At noong 2005, lumipat naman siya sa lab ni Dr. Ed Gomez. At nagmula doon, basically, na-base na siya sa halos isang dekada. At hanggang ngayon, actually, din si Dr. Wang sa Banan. Noong taong, ay, ang taon, sorry, nag-PhD siya sa University of Baria-Rodriguez. Anong taon yun ba? In 2012, okay. At bumalik siya sa MSI noong taong 2017 bilang assistant professor. Sorry, ngayon siya isang associate professor at the same time deputy director ng Baria-Rodriguez Laboratory. She specializes in marine ecology, and she helps the interactions of marine biomes and benthic ecosystems lab or imbibe lab, and where she leads research on the biology and interactions of coral reef benthic organisms. Her research projects aim to advance the science and socio-political governance of coral restoration efforts in the Philippines. And the objective is to use her research findings as a foundation for evidence-based policies that promote effective management and conservation practices. The title of her talk today is Advancing Coral Restoration in the Philippines, Integrating Science, Policy, and Practice, and this is part of the MSI at 50 lecture series. So let's give the floor to Dr. Baria-Rodriguez.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me online clearly? I hope you can. Okay, I am actually honored to be speaking to you in front of the pillars of coral restoration in the country. Now, Dr. Yap is here, so later you will see that she is one of the pillars or provided a foundation for coral restoration in the country. Okay, the motivation of this talk stems from the global call to restore coral reef, not coral reef, but ecosystem. So this year, from 2021 to 2030, it was declared by the United Nations that it is the ocean, the decade of the ocean, the science that we need for the ocean that we want. And one of the targets is on protect and restore ecosystems and biodiversity. This was further supported by the 23 targets of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So there are 23, and number 2 is effective restoration of 30% of areas of degraded ecosystems. Yeah. So now I'll be giving you a talk on advancing coral restoration in the Philippines, integrating science, policy, and practice. Okay, so if we start with the definition of coral restoration, it is the process of assisting the recovery of coral reefs that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed, and this was coined by the International Society of Ecological Restoration in 1998. Okay. What you're seeing on the screen now is a word cloud taken from the presentation of Dr. Nathan Cook in 2018 during the Reef Futures in Florida. This was from Reef Ecology. So what you're seeing now, these are actually the giants of coral restoration globally. So the bigger the name, the more giant, the more contribution to coral restoration research. So obviously, when you look at the screen, it's Dr. Rinkiewicz, Buki Rinkiewicz, followed by Dr. Gomez and Dr. Yap, who's here, and Dr. Edwards, and among others. I think I became not stuck, became so interested in coral restoration science because of these pillars. And these pillars were actually some of my mentors when I was working in Bolinao as a research student working on larval propagation for coral restoration. This is a picture that was taken in 2005 or 2006. We have a project, actually Dr. Gomez has a project on World Bank GEF Coral Reef Targeted Research Program. And there is a working group on restoration and remediation, which I was part of it. Okay, so let's look into the picture. This is Dr. Rikiewicz from Israel. This is Dr. Andrew Hilliard. Dr. Eileen Morse, Prof. Chow, of course, Dr. Gomez, Dr. Makoto Amori. Unfortunately, some of the pillars are already in the second. They're not to point out some of my. Oh, this is Dr. R. Edwards. So if you look back at the figure before I presented, those are really the big names of coral restoration experts globally. So I'm super lucky to be working with them at some point of my career. And some of the pillars here, Dr. Remy Dizon, I hope you are online. He's from UP Baguio. Our very own Dr. Patrick Cabaitan. Who else? Of course, the recently famous Dr. Dexter De La Cruz on level enhancement. And these are, Anja is here. Come again? Doc Ronald was not here. Unfortunately, the late Dr. Ronald Villanueva. So some of my colleagues, so we were in Bolinao for more than 5 years working on understanding on coral biology and ecology and coral restoration. Okay, so in the Philippines, who are the giants? Giants, I've been calling them giants. But yeah, Dr. Gomez is the first, followed by Dr. Yap and Dr. Dizon. But this was in 2018. So that means that the publications from 2019 onwards were not included. So there's Dr. Cabaitan, me, Dexter De La Cruz, Dr. Perry Alinio, Dr. Villanueva, among others. So we're all together in one team working in Bolinao. Okay, so now let's look at the history of coral restoration, looking at the science aspect. Okay, but before that, I'd like to introduce this slide on the propagules for coral restoration, which was recently published by R. Edwards and colleagues in Current Biology. So there are different sources of coral propagules, sexual and asexual. For sexual, of course, the utilization of spawning or coral propagules, then followed by the introduction to different substrates. It can either be land-based or in the hatchery, or it can either be sea-based. For sexual propagation, we can utilize spawn slick and introduce it to different substrates, consolidated and unconsolidated substrates. For asexual propagation, these are actually basically fragmenting coral colonies to microfragmentation, and then this can be directly outplanted on the reef. It can be cultured in the land-based nursery, or it can be cultured to sea-based nursery prior to planting or transplanting to targeted reef area. Okay, a little bit of biology. This is a colony of Acropora digitiferous spawning at around 8 to 9 p.m. in the culture tank. So usually coral spawns at night, and majority of the corals are actually broadcast spawners. Um, it's when it spawns, it releases gametes in the water column. This is followed by embryogenesis and then larval settlement until it becomes juvenile and adult. Oops. In the Philippines, we found out that there is a multi-species spawning. Um, in 2018, actually, when we did this work, we've been diving on the reefs of select areas in Bolinao and Anda for 3 years during full moon, around full moon from March to June, July. And we were able to discover that majority of the corals in Bolinao spawns during summer months from March to June. Yeah, so what are the advantages and disadvantages? I'm sorry about the title. What are the disadvantages and advantages of using sexual and asexual mode of propagation? For asexual, fragmentation is a natural mode of propagation in some species, which translates to high survival. There is collateral damage to donor colony and fragments. It bypasses larvae to juvenile stage, and there is an immediate increase in live coral cover. And before 2015, it was said that asexual mode of propagation was less costly. However, for sexual propagule, um, uh, produced propagules are typically distinct, which means that it has an advantage to avoid massive die-off. There is no collateral damage. Sorry. There is no collateral damage to donor colonies and more costly and laborious. Okay. I think this is the meat of the history of coral restoration in the Philippines. I've been doing a review of the restoration efforts in the country and looking at papers. This is actually based on publications. And this figure is actually a timeline of the progress of coral restoration research. So each point is actually a paper. The bigger the circle, it means that there are more papers. And for each point, these are actually not the publication date, but it's actually the date of the conduct of research. So this started in early 1980s with Dr. Gomez and Dr. Yap using asexual mode of propagation. So, okay, so I'll just, so this figure shows different restoration work on asexual, sexual, and substrate enhancement. For asexual, direct, land-based nursery, sea-based nursery, and nursery to reef. Similarly for sexual, but for substrate enhancement, there's no such. Okay, so let's focus your attention now to this blue rectangle. For asexual, it started in 1980s, and then later in 2000, and in 2000 there is actually already the utilization of table nursery for coral gardening approach prior to transplanting on the leaf. And then later in 2010, there's already a technique on using nurseries and floating nurseries that were introduced by the group of Dr. Linkiewicz. And then later, there's already study looking at community-based coral transplantation. For sexual mode of propagation or restoration for direct seeding, there's already work on direct seeding actually in 1997 to 1991 with a group of Dr. Lori Raimundo of Silliman University. Here, so they looked at Posilopora damicornis, but they did it in the laboratory and they also outplanted it on the reef. And in 2010, there was actually an increase of the utilization of sexual propagules for restoration, and there was even an approach looking or adding at algal grazers. So this is top shell Trochus niloticus that actually eats the algae that outcompetes for coral growth. And then later, you will notice that majority of the publications close to 2020 are really focused on sexual propagation. And there is a reason for that. And then for direct seeding, this started in around 2013 to 15. This was start by the group of Professor Peter Harrison and Dexter de la Cruz. For substrate enhancement, um, actually, this started in around 2003 by the group of, again, Dr. Raimundo in one of the marine protected areas in the Visayas. So what later I'll show you what it looks like. And then later, there are publications on the use of artificial substrate with coral transplants. We call it pallet ball, or it's also known as reef balls, and then the addition of herbivores to maximize coral restoration. And also for substrate enhancement, there has been work on the utilization of various adhesives and also various substrate, and it's still continuing at present. Okay. We know that the climate is changing and corals are responding differently. And currently, most of the efforts are working at the species level and sometimes at the genetic level. So currently, more work are focused on gene banking and assisted evolution. If you have listened to the talk of Dr. Cecilia Conaco, she mentioned majority of the work because most of her work actually are focused on gene banking and assisted evolution. But in this talk, I will not be discussing this. Just so you know that the focus now of the on coral restoration is really looking at the resilient species that will be used for restoration. Okay, a little. So I will go through each of the techniques and give you a few examples and photos of photos that were conducted in the site. So this one for asexual direct transplantation, this is a picture of Porites cylindrica. So these are Porites cylindrica that were transplanted on coral outcrops or coral bommies. And it's very obvious. This is 0 months. After 10 months and 36 months, it flourished into something like this. Okay. And then another one is direct transplantation. This is actually our work with Dexter and Dr. Ronald Villanueva. So we used Acropora intermedia, this one, and Acropora pulchra to outplant it to Lucero area. And after 14 months, actually this was quite successful. So next, as an example of asexual or table nurseries, these are a few examples. This is an Acropora fragment inserted to plastic tocks and then inserted to mesh. And then these are examples of sea-based table nurseries with multiple different types of substrates. These are giant clam shells used as substrates in the table nursery. Next are sea-based coral nurseries. These are actually floating table nurseries with, this is an Acropora species, Montipora digitata, and Acropora tenuis on, this is a rope nursery, and I got this from the paper of Dr. Rinkiewicz. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that in 2007, the group of Dr. Lori Raimundo published a paper on substrate stabilization. Basically, this is actually a rubber field that was inside the marine protected area for 20 years. So they explored the utilization of this substrate. Actually, it's a mesh net, and then they covered it with boulders. And after a few months, there was a significant increase in natural recruits here, as you can see. And the literature, actually, one of the in the acknowledgement section, they mentioned Dr. Gomez, because Dr. Gomez assisted them through his Pew Fellowship grant. Okay, some examples of nurseries for sexual propagation. So most of our work really before 2020, we really utilized the outdoor hatchery facility to spawn corals and use different substrates. For substrates, any hard substrate actually works, but in this case, we just used cement, and then we outplant them. Actually, this is a nursery, an ocean nursery, where we put all the cementox with coral recruits. Okay, this is my master's paper. I looked at the effect of caging on post-settlement survival of Acropora tenuis juvenile, and I found out that actually caging has a positive effect on the survival. But we have to consider that in this paper, we only monitored until 3 months, because for sure, after 3 months, there is already an overgrowth of algae and sponges. So therefore, it is really important to culture corals with herbivores if you opt for this caging type of culture. Okay. Another work that we've done was utilizing stress tolerant corals for a reef restoration. In this paper, this is actually Phavitis abita and Phavitis coal mining. And this figure shows you that actually it's plug yields. Basically, survival from egg site to nursery in the outdoor hatchery, in the ocean nursery, and when we outplanted them on the reef. So after 72 months, survival was actually more than around 40 to 45%. So in research work and in culture work, this is already a milestone. Yeah, because 72 months is very long. And it also shows that survival is around 40%. This is a very high survival in coral culture. So we are actually very proud of this work, because until now you will see all of these corals on the reef, even if there were many bleaching events in Anda area. So we found out that after 5 to 6 years, these corals are already reproductively mature. So it takes slow, because normally for corals, for example, for Acropora, they can be reproductive by the age of 2 or 3. But those species are not stress tolerant. They are competitive, and they are actually sensitive to thermal stress. So this is how it looks like on the reef now. So we deploy them in a few reefs in Bolinao Anda area. Okay. So another example of coral restoration effort is direct seeding. So we have already seen asexual mode of propagation, sexual mode of propagation, utilizing different substrate, and this time it's the direct seeding or larval enhancement on the reef. So this technique is actually taking advantage of the knowledge of the timing of coral reproduction on the reef, where our group collects coral and then reared it to ocean, to the pontoon, we call it pontoon or floater on the reef for about 3 days, and then we put them directly on the substrate but with a mesh, and we put it for around 24 to 48 hours, and then check for recruitment. Okay, so this is one of, I think, the most important paper in terms of level enhancement, where Dr. De La Cruz and Peter Harrison showed that direct seeding can actually enhance level supply and recruitment on degraded reef. So this figure shows that in areas with enhanced larvae, there's a lot of recruits done in control, and these are actually on the settlement plates. So this is actually one of the promising research on coral restoration now in terms of scalability and also the potential for resilient corals. Okay, so I'll just show you our paper. This is actually a paper with Dr. Yap, Dr. Dizon, Dexter, among others. Sexually derived corals are more cost effective than asexual counterpart. It has been a question on coral restoration effort. The cost has always been a question. You know, you can do all the restoration that you want, but the question is how much, right? And that's always the question of policymakers. So this was actually a challenge even when I was a student. So we did compare sexual and asexual propagule performance on the nursery, on the coral, and on the coral bommies. And obviously, for survival and also for the survival in the nursery and also on the bommies, sexual propagules have higher survival than asexual counterpart. And we looked at the costs. For the cost, sexual propagules at that time was $18 and asexual is $22, which is contrary to the previous notion that asexual is more is less expensive than sexual counterpart. Okay, I'll just run through some of the corals that were used for asexual propagation. Different types of corals, actually, Echinopora lamellosa, Porites, many species of Acropora, Montipora, Acropora, Heliopora, Pavona species, and Hypnophora, Merulina, and Posiloporids or Posilopora species. How about for sexual mode of propagation? Majority are really on Acropora species, Acropora granulosa, Millepora, and Acropora tenuis. And some others, we also worked with Favites, and also some Posiloporids, Posilopora acuta, formerly known as Posilopora damicornis, and Seriatopora caliendrum. Okay, so what are the key findings? So the key findings are the following. What are the important criteria for restoration? Site, species, orientation, number and combination of transplants, cost, water quality, quality of the substrates. Actually, I forgot to list environmental parameters. In terms of scalability, coral nurseries can actually produce a number of fragments, unfortunately with limited genetic diversity. Sexual recruits offers potential of high survival on the reef. Direct seeding using coral sleek offers diversity, potential resilience, and mass production. In terms of costs, sexual propagules are cheaper than fragments, and actually the cost can still be reduced. So in the economy of scale, if you do it on a bigger scale, actually the cost earlier that I have showed you around $18, we can still reduce it to cheaper, maybe less than $5 or maybe even less. Okay, now we move on to the national policies relevant to coral restoration. Okay. Uh, we have published, actually, if you look at our review paper now of Matores and my colleagues, we have a list of many policies relevant to coral restoration, but I just only emphasize a few of this in this presentation. The first one is the Republic Act 8550, or also known as the Philippine Fisheries Code of 1998. In Section 19, there is a ban on coral exploitation and exportation. In 2001, RA 9147, Wildlife Resources Conservation and Protection Act. In 2014, this RA 8550 was revised. RA to RA 10654, an act to prevent, deter, and eliminate IUU fishing. And there's a section on ban on coral exploitation and exportation. In 2000, there's a joint memorandum order with DENR, Department of Agriculture, DILG, and DND on the guidelines on the establishment, management, and utilization of artificial reefs in municipal water. In 2004, there is another joint memorandum, but with DENR, DA, and PCSD on joint implementing rules and regulations pursuant to Republic Act 9147 on providing for the conservation and protection of wildlife resources and their habitats, appropriating funds therefore and for other purposes. BNB issued a technical bulletin 2019-03 on the general considerations for coral reef ecosystems restoration or rehabilitation. So let's focus on the RA 10654, Section 96 on ban on coral exploitation and exportation. So I just summarize, I just list what's on it. Any form of possession is unlawful except for scientific and research purposes. So what does this mean? You cannot just collect corals because you want to collect, or you just want to put it in your aquaria at home, or you just want to help restore in your nearby, for example, reef. You cannot just do that. You get punished. You will be actually punished. And there is an admin fine of 500 or half million to 10 million if you get caught. And imprisonment of 10 to 20 years and a fine equivalent to twice the admin fee. And also, you will be required to pay for the restoration costs. So payment is based on the available studies and as determined by the department. This is, I think, for all the practitioners who are present or attending this talk, this is very important. Okay, so what for any coral restoration research or any collection, we are required by the law to acquire gratuitous permit from BFAR. So to do this, you have to secure first letter of intent. This is endorsed by your agency head or the director. Prior informed consent. Prior informed consent, you get this from the local government unit. And then project proposal, or approved project proposal, and memorandum of agreement or MOU, and the resume of project investigator. Why do you think it is important to have this resume of project investigator? To establish that that project is really for research purpose, right? Remember, in the section 96, it's only for research purpose. Okay, so this is the technical bulletin that was made by BMB. On section 1, the objective is to provide the protected area managers, local government units, and other field implementers a strategic, sustainable, and ecosystem-based approach in protecting and rehabilitating degraded coral reef ecosystems in their respective area. This will also serve as a guide in assessing and evaluating past and ongoing efforts on coral reef rehabilitation. Okay, so let's go back to the definition of restoration. So it's an act of bringing degraded reef ecosystem back into or nearby as nearly possible to original condition. So usually restoration has these aims for fisheries, restoration of benthic biodiversity, shoreline protection, socio-economic reason, or bring back the ecosystem services such as food security, shoreline protection. Why did I bring this up? Because at this time, we are faced by the challenge of climate change as well as our local threats. And if we are very strict about restoration, it is really impossible to do that. That's why all the restoration efforts now, I believe, is just a rehabilitation effort. So it's an act of partially or more rarely fully replacing structural and functional characteristics of an ecosystem that have been diminished or lost, or the substitution of alternative qualities or characteristics. This is actually a picture of our corals. It's around 15 years old now. Okay, before doing any restoration efforts, there are two important caveats. First, although restoration can enhance conservation efforts, restoration is always a poor second to the preservation of original habitats. The use of ex situ restoration or mitigation as an equal replacement for habitat and population destruction or degradation is at best unsupported by evidence and is at worst an irresponsible, degradative force in its own right. This is very important, especially for the practitioners. Okay, so in the technical bulletin of that was issued by BNB, there is actually an attachment on the guideline on how to do or conduct coral restoration. They have this Annex 1, Decision Tree Guide on Conducting Coral Reef Restoration Project as adopted from Edwards and Gomez, 2007. Actually, I'll just run through it. It's not so clear, but first question is, did the site support a coral community prior to disturbance? If yes or no. If no, carefully consider whether active restoration is appropriate. If yes, is the water quality satisfactory? If yes, then is the substrate at site stable? If yes, then is the algae herbivore balance conducive for coral recovery? If yes, is the recruitment limited? And if yes, you can develop restoration plan. Otherwise, forget about restoration because your resources will just be wasted. Okay, so this is, I'll just give you an overview of a rehabilitation project. First, we do some initial scoping. This initial scoping is actually based on the decision tree matrix that I have introduced earlier. Fact finding for rehabilitation plan, develop detailed rehabilitation plan, implement, monitoring, evaluation, and feedback to stakeholders. And I think not just for restoration, for any effort, like for example, for any monitoring in the marine protected area, I think it's very important to, this number 5 is very important. Monitoring, evaluation, and feedback to stakeholders. And all of these are central to this. Financial and human resources available. Are the plans ecologically, socially, economically, and politically sustainable? So that's for the overview. So now that we know that there are policies relevant to coral restoration, that you cannot just do any restoration anytime you want unless it's for research purpose. Now we move on to the practice. Okay. This 2024, we published a review paper on coral restoration activities in the Philippines. This is a map, a Philippine map with different colors, like pink to dark red. So pink means there's one number of reports, and then if it goes darker, it means that the reports are bigger. Okay, by just looking at the figure, you'll see that there are a lot of restoration efforts in the country, right? So, but the our law says that you cannot just do any restoration, right? But coral restoration practices actually are rampant in the country. So we have a database on coral restoration, and there are a lot of entries, more than 400 entries from 1977 to 2023. And these were validated with publications, reports, and interviews. And these are some restoration activities, artificial use of artificial reefs, asexual and sexual reproduction, and combination of methods. And actually, these activities are distributed in 228 municipalities. So can you imagine that? They have so much money for coral restoration. And the question is it successful? We don't know. Okay, so this is a figure on the cumulative number of restoration projects from 1977 to 2003. It's not so clear, but this is the count, and these are the year. At first, artificial reef, and then later moved to asexual, and then actually in the late 2020s, more on the use of sexual and asexual mode of propagation. Okay, so what are our data source? Majority are actually from the proceedings, followed by online news, report, journals, and social media. So only 9.2% are from journals, which means these are from the publications. Who are the proponents? 20% from the academe, 13% from CSOs and NGOs, 51% from the government, 4.7% from private sector, and sorry, 3.5% from tourism industry. And what are the restoration objectives? To rehabilitate reef habitats in support of biodiversity conservation, improve fisheries productivity, tourism, research or experimental, community awareness, education and participation, and corporate social responsibility. So these are the perceived benefits of restoration, ecological success, but mainly on the survival and growth of corals, employment through restoration efforts, but there's very minimal, and then tourism. More and more of the coral restoration efforts in the country really are focused on the tourism benefit. Okay, so knowledge on policies or the application process. Are all of these activities or are all of these proponents knowledgeable that there is a policy that they have to secure permits prior to the conduct of restoration? Well, most of the informants in this paper are not aware of the gratuitous permit requirement from BFAR. The projects are operated without gratuitous permit provided and they provided many reasons. Some they said that it's too tedious, it takes a long time, it's just time consuming in short. Of course, if you're doing research, if you're a student and you only have 6 months to finish your work, and if the process of getting the gratuitous permit takes more than the duration of your experiment, that's impossible unless you don't want you to finish on time. Next, for Palawan-based projects, the NGOs coordinated with PCSD, but they still did not secure permit. All of the informants believe that gratuitous permit application process takes a very long time. Okay, I scanned through the internet to check for the uh, practices of on coral restoration in the Philippines, and this is what I saw. Some of the artificial substrates, these are divers, those are substrate, and this one, they even put this dome on seagrass. And this is a perfect disaster. Not a good example, okay? You want to restore reef, but you put the artificial structure on seagrass bed. Classic bad example. And these are actually the artificial structures. So can you just imagine how much resources that they used for this one? Say if you have one of this, you can already have a student in MSI to finish her grad school. You can support research, right? This one, I'm sure this one also, can you imagine the effort of divers or I don't know who are the proponents, but they have so much money for this. And maybe they are benefiting or maybe there is a profit because it's kept on increasing. We don't know. Something that we have to check and verify. Also, some of the efforts, coral nurseries, they direct transplant. These are actually staghorn corals outplanted on coral dummies. This one I'm not sure. Anyway, so what are the key findings? Coral restoration activities is increasing and will be increasing because they can justify, right? Because there is a global call of action to restore ecosystem. That's a very strong justification of doing restoration. Um, Growing concern of unregulated projects. There's no gratuitous permit to collect corals. Most highlight ecological benefits but with limited socio-economic benefits. Okay, now this is my assignment. Proposed National Coral Restoration Framework. Uh, Actually, we've been doing coral restoration, but in fact, we don't have really a national framework for it. We just have a guideline that you cannot just collect corals, right? You can only collect for research purposes. But there's already a lot of work, rampant activities on coral restoration, and I think it's about time to have a national coral restoration framework. Oops. So, the proposal is to have a joint administrative order with DNR, DA, and DILG on National Coral Restoration Framework, and then can come up with a National Technical Working Group. And this National Technical Working Group will coordinate with the regional hub, and this regional hub will also coordinate with multi-stakeholders or the proponents or the practitioners. And there should always be an open communication or open line across stakeholders. Okay, why joint administrative order? Because for obvious reason. It's efficient, right? So if DNR, DA, and DILG are already there, they are the key players, especially LGU, because in the policy, you cannot do any restoration effort without prior informed consent. You cannot even get a gratuitous permit if you don't have a permit from the LG. Next, what will be the role of this technical working group? It will be composed of experts on coral restoration in relevant fields, can be coral reef ecologists, social scientists, environmental economists, and policy experts. And this technical working group will provide scientific data or evidence to support the policy. So first, by reviewing information on multiple aspects of coral restoration, can map all the coral restoration efforts we have already started. And I think it's really a good data. We already have a good data for this. Map all the graded reef areas with coral restoration potential. So this is actually very important. Why? Because you cannot, I believe that any restoration effort should be anchored to the ICM or Integrated Coastal Management plan of an area, and within the ICM there are marine protected areas, and in the marine protected areas there is an M&E section, monitoring and evaluation, and I think coral restoration should be part of it, right? It's a part of a greater M&E. And then, recommended guidelines on the conduct of coral restoration. This technical working group can revisit and revise the coral restoration decision tree matrix that was presented earlier, and it can be customized to the current state. So we can consider, for example, MPAs as option for reef restoration because, for another obvious reason, it's already protected and ideally it's regulated, less source of degradation. Okay, our Coral Restoration Regional Hub. So I propose that there will be a restoration hub per region, and this can be led by the BFAR regional office, and this can be composed of experts from different HEIs and SUCs, and again, coral ecologists or marine biologists, maybe marine biologists, because I think coral reef ecologists are still limited, social scientists, environmental economists, and policy expert. And then the role is like a technical advisory board. They will evaluate the evaluation of required documents, and they can also do the monitoring of the project. And they can either reject or endorse for the approval of BFAR and prior to the signature of the department DA secretary. Okay, so for multi-stakeholders, I've already mentioned different proponents, NGOs, NGOs, research institutions, SUCs, and HEIs. Uh, so I mentioned earlier that there are a lot of coral restoration efforts, activities outside of research. So that only means that there is really a heart to for the environment. I mean, we care for the environment. It's just I can synonymize it to right love at the wrong time, right? So you have the heart to help the environment, and you think that restoration is the answer. Fortunately, there is a policy, and we have to go through it prior to doing any restoration effort. And maybe you need technical assistance or technical guidance from us, or maybe from other scientists, and you can collaborate with them, come up with a proposal, and submit it to the department. Okay, so this is my proposal for the application process, because now if you look at if you Google, for example, gratuitous permit from BFAR, there's really is there an online platform for that? Okay, there's no online yet. Maybe no online yet. So preferably, I think it would be ideal if we have an online platform for the application process. So the project proponents submit all the requirements to the regional hub. The regional hub reviews all the documents, and then the DA reviews and approves grant. And after that, when you get the GP, you implement the project, and while doing the implementation, it will be monitored. There's a coordination with regional hub. So regional hub will monitor and evaluate the project. And this is actually for the national. This is the national regional hub submits to the national database. So it's about time to come up with a national database. We already started working with BFAR and DANR, and we already have the database. In fact, if you search it on the internet, it's available, but it's still a secret. Just kidding. It's available. You can try. We're still working on several papers on it, and hopefully it will come out soon. But it's available. Anyway, um, so this is my proposal, and I'd like to sorry, point out here that the priority areas for improving coral restoration practice. So there's already regional coral restoration hub. It's really important to have this learning network of sharing best practices, communication and engagement, and this platform can be, a source of idea for sustainable financing mechanism. Oops. So I'm just lucky these days because I have 4 coral restoration projects and I'm working with many experts on the field. First one is Asia-funded Regional Coral Restoration Project with Professor Peter Harrison, some of my colleagues, Dr. Kabaitan and Cecilia Conaco. And then another Asia-funded project on coral restoration governance with Dr. Mike Fabini and Vera. And also we have a project in Zambales with DFAT working with Peter and the Mid Foundation and some others. And then recently we got a grant from CORDAP or Coral Adapt project with James Guest, Pete Mambi, among others, and my colleagues, Alet and also Rachel. And if you know Vic Dixon, we are actually working on heritability of thermotolerance of coral. So we are looking at coral resilience and how we will use this to restore coral populations on the reef. Oops. So yeah, that ends my presentation and thank you very much for listening.
Maraming salamat, Vanan. The floor is now open for any questions or comments, and both from here in MSI AVR and via Zoom. And of course, I'd like to prioritize sana muna yung mga graduate students natin. I'm sure we have a lot of burning questions.
Meron ba? Wala.
Hi, I'm Prince. Just a question po about monitoring. Like, do you have existing data or research that attempted to at least quantify yung parang long-term effects po ng mga restoration efforts? Like, how do we even know that they work? And dami pong effort pero.
Yes.
Have data for them?
I don't have data for everything, but we have data actually in Bolinao. One of my research students now is actually working on the revisiting all the restoration efforts in Bolinao and checking if they're still there. If they're not, then it's gone. Okay, and apparently there are mga around 15 to 20 projects, and we looked at multiple species, mostly acroporids, as I mentioned. And I don't want to preempt her thesis, but most of the corals that were left are actually stress-tolerant species. But not to mention that, for example, for larval seeding that I have mentioned, acroporids are also flourishing. But this was seeded in 2013 to 2015. In fact, it's not published yet, but in one of our projects with the Asia Regional Coral Restoration team, we have successfully restored areas in 100 islands. I can show you a picture later. It's really good. It's multi-species of Acropora. We utilized coral slick. So coral slick, actually, this is a multiple species of gametes or embryos that spawn from one night, and then we collect them, and then after 2 days, 2 to 3 days, we put it on the reef, degraded reef, and it's amazing. It works. It really works. And I think it's a very good proof of concept. And what we are doing now is we are doing it in other areas of the country, not just in Bolinao. We have a project in Palawan, San Vicente, Palawan. We have a project in Lobo, Batangas. And we also have a project in Cebu. So in Cebu, we are working with resort resort staff, because there are so many resorts in Cebu. In Lobo, Batangas, we are working with the LGU as well as in San Vicente, Palawan. Yeah, so to answer your question, I have a long-term data. It's just that we need to publish it. There is, in Bolinao, majority are stress tolerant, but there are some acroporids. But it's really, I think to follow your line of thinking, I think you were asking how about the others that were done in 1990s or 2000, what happened? We don't know. That's why one of my proposals actually, it's becoming my advocacy now. I really wanted to go to all the sites and check because we have the coordinates and check if they're still there, whether it's working or not. Because I think that's the best evidence that some doesn't really work. It's a waste of money. Majority is really a waste of money. But we have to prove that. Yep.
Thank you. I'm not right. You wanted to say something before I go?
Thank you very much, Van. I really appreciate taking science to the practice and policy, especially for work in the reef, which is one of our core programs here at MSI. So siguro just 2 points. You've talked about areas where you might want to do this. Might you consider shoals, offshore areas where so much funds and money are going to, yeah, and of broader interest? So siguro that's one. Maybe it would be more logistically challenging, pero with the information you have and all, it might be very strategic. I didn't say that. Helen said that. So the other thing I wanted to mention when you were talking about the permits, you are aware that many of the permits are also related to construction of jetties and all of that, which is part of the environmental compliance certificate requirements. So those are conditionalities. If there are reefs na masasagasaan, mano, how much replacement, it's so you really have to look into that. And you are aware that right now the mechanism of BFAR for all coral related stuff is to pass them on to the Philippine Aquatic Red List Subcommittee on Invertebrates. So if we can put more system into that, kasi it's like, yun nga, it's an intermediate backstop, which is not very effective because I don't know if they actually curate the information, no? Because that's very important. There's a lot of that going on. And at the level of DNR and BFAR sometimes.
Thank you, Mama Net.
Okay, let's take a question from Zoom for now. Wala? Sa Q&A box, hindi sa chat. Okay. Question muna from MSI, ADR.
Hi, good morning, ma'am. My name is Miggy Lapiral. I currently work with Semirara Marine Lab and Hatchery. We're based out of northwestern Panaypo and the province of Antique. And the lab mainly focuses on giant clam hatchery and rehab. I was curious lang po, you mentioned po that artificial reefs normally don't work and can be quite disastrous. And considering po that more than 60% come from, I guess, resorts and LGUs. I'm curious po, where does this notion come from within these communities that, you know, they want to help, but they get this wrong idea? Curious lang po ako, paano yung pumasok yung idea na yun sa kanila, and what can we do to, you know, help them, you know, make better decisions and love the right way? You know?
Love the right way. Actually, I don't know. But yung artificial structure, I think though, okay, if you remember one of my slides, before actually as a policy guidance on artificial structure, before has been doing this artificial structure, but mainly for fisheries purposes, but not really for coral restoration. But recently, there's really an increase in the utilization of artificial reefs to restore corals. Okay, I would argue that um okay, it's not uh, okay. It's not something that I want to do. Okay, if I have so much money for restoration, artificial reefs is a no-no for restoration. Why? It's not cost efficient. Okay, if you want to restore reefs, there are a lot of consolidated substrates that are degraded. Put your effort there, not an artificial structure. How much is one artificial structure? And how much degraded reef area that we have? There's so much. I mean, artificial structure is really, it says artificial, so it's not natural. So it means the chances of success is low. A majority actually of these artificial structures, they deploy it in sandy areas, right? And there's no coral there. So I don't know. They're so creative in imagining that corals were settled in artificial structures that were deployed in sandy areas. That some even are far from nearby reef. So they're just so creative. I don't know. It's impossible to restore sandy area with corals that in fact there are no corals, right? So it's illogical actually. Um yeah, so that's I hope I answered your question. The boom of artificial structure, we have to look into it more closely. We have a database and because some of in the review paper it's just a list. We haven't really checked it or validated it on site, and I think that's one thing that we have to do. And it's really important. It's an important information that we can provide for the joint administrative order as a basis. For example, for not recommending in case of artificial structure to restore degraded reefs.
So yun ay napakalinaw nung mensahe ni Doc Van na we have to be much more strategic in our efforts na it's not worth doing these kinds of restoration efforts. Before we move on to another question, I just wanted to parang to ride this particular theme right now kasi it was very catchy the way you said, you know, the right love at the wrong time, ganyan. And I think many of us appreciate where the sentiment is coming from. A lot of people want to do something, want to help. So I've been meaning to ask before we leave this topic, na, do you have any recommendations for any, you know, when there are people who really want to do something to demonstrate their love for the oceans and desire to protect or restore, instead of doing these, say, artificial reefs or other efforts? Any recommendations that they can do that's, you know, low tech and ba? Kasi people want to be hands-on.
Mm-mm. Well, there are a lot of conservation efforts on coral reefs. There are, for example, marine protected areas. There are some programs of collecting litter, for example, on the reefs. You know, scuba divers, scuba serero. I think at some point it makes sense, although it's expensive. There are also, remember, these restoration efforts should be placed in the context of integrated coastal management plan. That means that you are helping coral reefs if you are helping the cause of threat from ridge to reef. So any activity that reduces threats to coral ecosystem, I think that's something that you can do or focus with. For example, I don't know, what are some terrestrial efforts now? Maybe reforestation. It is indirectly helping our coral reefs, right? And some other activities, land-based pollution. Maybe if you have so much money, you can help the LGU in assisting them with their coastal CLUWP, right? Coastal land use map, water plan, what land use plan. Yeah.
Since Michelle is here, uh, there's a benefit to studying the structures that have been placed even in bizarre areas like the seagrass. I don't know if you know the name Rusty Bernard. He was advocating looking at all of the types of organisms that settle on substrates. So Michelle is a biodiversity specialist. I don't know if you think it's worthwhile to look at what has settled on these artificial structures as an ecological study in different kinds of habitats. There are just a few drawbacks, like hindi mo alam ang date kung kailan sila nilagay, di ba? So maybe you can do some detective work, and then hindi ko alam kung replicated sila. Nako. So yan ang medyo tricky, no? But there's a lot of useful ecological information kung matyaga kayo, and if there's some graduate students who are willing to do it, to assess what kinds of communities settle in artificial substrates and sandy areas, on seagrass beds, different parts of the Philippines with different exposure ecological conditions. That's very worthwhile to augment our biodiversity research. Yun lang, we have to get around the question of how long have they been, and the replication to me, I don't know about that, but it's still very useful information. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Great idea.
Yeah, actually, okay. Dr. Liquanen's group published a paper on artificial structures deployed some in Batangas. They even put microfragments on it, and there were uh, eh, survival, but not so much. And I don't think there are so much other organisms or benthic organisms. Or maybe it's not just the focus of the paper. Yeah, I think Helen is correct. Especially for research purpose, we have to check other biota on the substrates. And it's actually sometimes it's a good indicator. For example, for water quality, that is very important in considering, for example, for any coral restoration activity. Thanks for that, Helen. Okay, okay.
While Van is putting up a picture, can we take a question from Zoom? This question was from Michelle Reyes. Does the law make a distinction between coral fragments that are naturally occurring, for example, after a storm, and corals that are actively removed from the reef?
Hi, Michelle. Sorry, I wasn't able to reply to your email. I'll do that. I got busy with this, preparing for this. Yeah, Michelle, no, there's no distinction. It just says that any form of possession of corals are actually illegal. So maybe that's something that we can consider in coming up with guidelines for the national coral restoration policy. Yeah, you should be there, Michelle. You should be part of the working group.
Other questions?
Good morning po. Thank you for the super enlightening talk. I'm Ramika from Ocolab. Question lang po, if just following what the others have asked, meron po ba kayong example ng NGO or any kind of initiative outside the academe that sort of tried to follow the rules or maybe tried to partner with appropriate research groups to parang to realize na talagang ituloy po yung restoration project or mostly po ba parang kanya-kanyang style? I'm not sure. Just to kind of...
Okay, I'm looking at Erlo now.
Ayun.
I think, yeah, one of the, yeah. We are working, currently working with the Mid Foundation, in Zambales. And I think it's, a good, opportunity, to assist them in doing any restoration effort that is right. Although, yeah. So that's one. I don't know of any foundation working with other state universities or research institutes. But based on our database, parang I cannot recall any. Erlo, can you? No,
Okay.
not yet.
Okay. And maybe just a second question po. Dun sa na-mention niyo po, dun sa asexual versus sexual propagation, you found that mas mura po actually yung sexual propagation, around $18 versus $21. Um, and it's like I found that result like super interesting po. And I was wondering if you can give a bit more of overview. Ano po yung factors considered? Kasi you mentioned in a previous slide na mas laborious yung pag-conduct nung ano. Yes, this po.
Okay, this one. So what we were considered, okay, we did a parallel culture of coral fragments and then coral juveniles from larvae. And then we monitored at some point, say after 6 months, we already know, or 1 year, we have already a size of sexual recruit. Say for example, it's around 3 centimeters. Forgive me because I cannot remember the paper. We did it long time ago. So say if it's already 3 centimeters sexual propagule, we cut a fragment similar size, right? And then we culture them together in the hatchery. We monitored for their growth and survival. And after that, we put them on the reef, ocean, or city. We also monitor for growth and survival. And then we put them to degraded reef. And then we also monitor for their growth and survival. Along the way, we also, during the experiment, we have listed all the materials that we used for costs. Okay. At the beginning, at the nursery stage, it's actually the costs for fragmentation or for asexual is cheaper than asexual. But at the end of the experiment, based on the survival, it's more cost efficient to use sexual, meaning it's getting cheaper because survival is higher. And the advantage is really, why did it survive better? One of the reasons is actually it grew faster. Okay, remember the rule in any effort, restoration effort, the bigger is better. Always. On the reef. Corals to have bigger is better because your chances of survival if you're bigger on the reef is higher. So that's the point. Yeah. Okay. I cannot find the presentation for Helen. I think she's so excited I cannot find it.
Okay, we'll take a question from Zoom, and then there's someone also who's raising their hand. Let's take the question first. Okay, there are 4 more questions from Zoom. The first one is from Jono Volvidalia from ERDB. With all the current advances in coral rehabilitation, what else needs to be done to fully understand the mechanisms involved in coral restoration and to successfully restore our degraded coral reefs? Ano pa ang mga kailangan gawin? What are the gaps? Thank you.
Okay, anong kailangan gawin? Well, unang-una, we have to reduce the threat, You cannot do it's you cannot do any restoration activity in areas that are degraded and no, in So, in areas with threats to coral survival, but in areas that are polluted or highly sedimented, you don't do any restoration effort. Actually, yeah, that's a good one. That's a very good question. I'd like to point out. In 1980s to 2020, the premise was we need to restore areas, degraded reef areas because of local threats. Okay, so that means that, for example, the perfect areas for restoration at that time was areas, for example, blasted area. No, it means that if they have eliminated or reduced blast fishing, you can do restoration. Or for example, areas that were bleached, but in areas with still high anthropogenic factors or effluents or different sources of pollution, if it's still there, you don't need to do that because it will fail. So that's one. I think we don't need some more research because we know places that are, for example, polluted and not. So that's your question. What research to be done? We have the okay. I think we don't need so much research for practice, really, because it's it's established. I mean, that's why in my proposal there is a proposed framework for joint administrative order because we already have the evidence and we can come up with uh, decision tree matrix where we can do some restoration activities with higher chances of restoration. But not to mention that we don't do any research, okay? Because maybe you will quote me. Research. Of course, we need R&D. R&D is the core why we are here, why MSI is here. We need to continue developing research, for example, that will contribute to the science of restoration and whatever we produced, we use it as a basis for policy. Uh, and now more and more, we are really looking at resilient species. So maybe that can be one of the research areas that we can do. It's really looking for actually resilient trees, resilient species, understanding why they are thriving even in harsh condition. I think that's one thing. But for basic coral restoration, maybe we can already guide you as to where. So we don't need that so much work. We just need to come up with a technical working group, a group of experts that will craft the guidelines for coral restoration, which includes, for example, species and site selection as to where we'll do any restoration activity. Provided that we have to follow the guidelines of DA or BFAR on the use of coral propagules. Maybe we need to revisit even Section 96 on ban on use of or ban of any collection of corals, right? So we are now working with the DANR, BMB, and also with BFAR, particularly on the fisheries FRMD, Fisheries Regulating MD, Management Division. So we are working with them closely and ideally or hopefully next year we can come up with this JAO or Joint Administrative Order. Of course, that Joint Administrative Order will not be finalized without feedback from multiple stakeholders. It will be presented prior to maybe being signed or finalized. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. This next question is from Tara Abrina. Hi, Ate Van. Congrats to everyone on taking restoration forward in the past few years. Are there other criteria for a successful restoration project besides mortality and cost effectiveness? If so, are these already operational in Philippine policy space?
Okay, ideally, when you talk about restoration benefits or ecological restoration, you just don't monitor corals, you also monitor the ecosystem function. That means that some also the ecological factor should be considered. Unfortunately, in the earlier days, we did not consider, for example, other invertebrates, fishes, but it's about time. Although we actually it's already part of our ongoing thanks Helen of our ongoing projects. We wanted to consider that. And aside from that, we also need to consider not just the biophysical, we also need to consider the social and economic aspects. That is what we aim in one of our projects now on Asia Coral Governance Project. We really wanted to incorporate the socio-economic governance because we wanted to capture the ecological and economic benefits of coral restoration. And more, if you read through or scan through the literature, sobrang daming papers on coral restoration globally. There are so many review papers now at nagsasabi na ang coral restoration, tinitingnan mo dapat siya na holistic. Although, if you argue, for example, that coral restoration, corals lang naman ang tinatanim nyo. Remember, corals are ecological engineers. What does it mean? It means that if you put coral, ultimately, some other organisms associated with them can come in. So that's actually dapat yung konsepto ng restoration, ecological restoration. But yeah, thanks, Tara. Siguro in your PhD, maybe you can consider that, or maybe you can assist us, for example, in looking at the economic benefits that we can get, for example, from coral restoration. Thank you.
This next question po is from an anonymous attendee. Do you think there is an effective way to address misguided coral restoration by well-meaning individuals and organizations, for example, cementing corals to the substrate, transplanting corals in seagrass beds?
Yeah. Siguro yung isa sa mga limitations of the technical bulletins that were disseminated, for example, by DANR, baka hindi hindi na roadshow. Roadshow ba yung tawag doon? Yung hindi na ipakita sa maraming stakeholders, no? So, importante talaga yung nilabas na technical bulletin ng BMB kasi it will serve as a guide for appropriate process of coral restoration. So, ayun, yun lang maganda. Kaya nga, actually, in my proposal, balik tayo doon. Hindi ako against sa mga hindi ako against sa mga taong nagre-restore actually. Okay tayo kasi pare-pareho tayo ng gusto. It's just that kailangan lang natin siyang ayusin. And more, actually, we can take advantage of the current practices, no? So this is a learning network or sharing of best practices. Kailangan kasi for coral restoration, meron talagang mga tao o grupo na committed, no? Para magturo ng tamang paraan ng coral restoration. And it's about time to come up with a learning network. So learning network or network of practitioners, researchers, and other stakeholders. So it's a platform where we can share successes and failures or successes and challenges of coral restoration. At pwedeng doon na mismo sa platform nito, i-guide sila o i-assist kung ano yung tamang paraan. At kung, for example, kung kailangan ng permit, no? So, meron ideally kasama dyan na taga-NGA, hindi lang NGOs or other practitioners. So, yun, it's about time. It's one of the goals of one of our projects, no? To come up with a learning network. In fact, there is a global learning network. If you are familiar with Refutures ang isa sa mga organizing committee. Ang grupo ay ang CRC or Coral Restoration Consortium. So Coral Restoration Consortium started with the Caribbean coral restoration practitioners and scientists. So it's a learning platform sharing studies on coral restoration and other practices. And they're expanding now to the Pacific. And merong iba't ibang section eh. I'm part of the coral propagation team. So I'm one of the coordinating committee member for CRC. It's not yet up, but we are working on it.
Thank you, ma'am. Apologies, we missed someone who raised their hand a while ago. It was Missy Carpizo. So if you're able to turn on your mic to Miss Missy Carpizo. Maybe as we wait, we can ask this next question also from Zoom. It's from Lawrence Cahalig. Hello, Rodriguez. Are there any implementations or studies of supercorals ongoing? Would it be ideal, considering increase the genetic diversity of biodiversity of corals, as only the cultivated supercoral would survive in the case of anthropogenic or climate-induced changes?
We are working on it. There are a group of hindi lang tayo, no, globally, there's really a search for, it's not a super coral, but we'll just call it resilient coral. Okay. Baka kasi pag na-imagine super, lilipad ba siya, lalaki ba siya? Joke lang. Yeah, we are working on identifying coral species that are resilient to many stressors. And now, majority of the work are really working towards understanding thermotolerance of coral species for obvious reason because of climate change. But more than that, there are also other efforts in looking at anong tawag dito? So for example, lagyan ng probiotics for corals, you know, when you put them out on the reef, it's like humans, no, na meron tayong vitamins, we go to the reef and then mataas yung tolerance natin, for example, to any anthropogenic stressors. Sometimes they're looking at the ideal microbiome that can enhance resilience, for example, of corals. There are also editing or transgenic of creating or developing transgenic organism. It's still in a very early stage. So what I'm saying is there are many coral scientists in the Philippines who are working on it. In fact, in one of my slides, I put out CORDAP project. CORDAP is an organization that supports scientists across globally towards coming up with resilient corals in the face of climate change. Yeah. So, and hopefully next year, I also have another project on cryopreservation. It's also funded by CORDAP. So I hope I answered your question on super coral. Let's call it resilient coral. Thank you.
Any questions from here in MSI? Anyone else? And person earlier is wala? Okay. So I think we already had quite a good discussion, no? So we can close the lecture today. Let's all give a big round of applause to Dr. Baria-Rodriguez. Thanks so much for being here and see you at the next MSI at 50 lecture.